Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. Both of them have one thing in common: how underestimating caving protocols can lead to devastating tragedy. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Paradise Springs, Florida, was known for its beauty, a hidden gem for divers seeking adventure in its crystal-clear waters. On September 22, 1996, two friends, Jake Miller and Lisa Carter, arrived at the site, eager to explore the depths. Both were certified open water divers, but had no formal training in cave diving. Still, the lure of the unknown was too tempting to resist. As they geared up, they went through the basics. The plan was discussed thoroughly just before they started their descent. Neither carried a safety guideline, a thin rope that trained cave divers used to find their way back. To them, it seemed unnecessary. They had dived together many times before, trusting their instincts and experience. The initial descent was breathtaking. At 60 feet, the entrance to the cave opened before them. They switched on their flashlights to illuminate their way. Jake led the way, moving cautiously into the narrow passage. Lisa followed closely behind, her heart pounding with both excitement and unease. As they ventured deeper, the passage narrowed. At 148 feet, they had gone farther than intended, but neither voiced concern. They were surrounded by silence, save for the rhythmic sound of their breathing through their regulators. Their lights danced along the limestone walls, revealing ancient formations that had stood untouched for millennia. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Jake, shifting his position, accidentally kicked up a thick layer of silt from the cavern floor. The fine particles billowed upward like smoke, consuming the light, transforming their surroundings into a suffocating void. Within seconds, visibility was reduced to zero. Lisa felt a surge of panic. She reached out, hoping to grasp Jake's arm, but her fingers met only empty water. The cave, once awe-inspiring, had become a prison. She forced herself to stay calm, breathing slow and steady. She knew panic was the greatest threat in an emergency. But Jake wasn't so lucky. Disoriented and blind, he flailed in the darkness, trying to retrace his steps. He turned in one direction, then another, each move only worsening his confusion. His breath quickened, draining his air supply at an alarming rate. His hand brushed against a narrow crevice in the rock, and in his desperation, he tried to squeeze through. But his tank and harness wedged him in place. He couldn't move at all. Panic surged through his body as there was no visibility. He was disoriented and couldn't even comprehend where and how he got stuck. It was pitch dark and he was wedged completely. Meanwhile, Lisa's mind raced. She swept her arms through the silt cloud, searching for any sign of her partner. Then suddenly she felt a shift in the water, a disturbance ahead. Something had moved. A collapse? Had the cave ceiling given way? Fear overtook her. If the cave was unstable, they were in grave danger. With her oxygen dwindling and no way to locate Jake, she made a split-second decision. She turned and ascended, kicking hard toward the surface. The journey back up felt endless. Every second, she expected to feel the crushing weight of the cave collapsing behind her. Breaking through the surface, she gasped for air and ripped off her mask. She immediately started contacting the emergency services for help. She knew the situation was dire, and Jake was on borrowed time. The clock was ticking, and for her, every minute felt heavy. Meanwhile, back inside, Jake was fighting for his life. His chest was crushed against the cold rock, his shoulders wedged tight in the crevice. He had stopped fighting for a moment, frozen in sheer terror. His breathing was shallow, ragged. The regulator in his mouth felt useless now. His tank was nearly empty. He had to get out. With desperate shaking hands, he fumbled at his harness, fingers numb and clumsy. The metal buckle refused to give at first, his gloves making the task even harder. He pulled again, harder this time. The strap loosened. He detached himself from the harness and tank. Suddenly, he was free. His body floated backward, weightless, but now he was blind in the swirling cloud of silt. No light, no direction. No tank meant no air. He had to make an escape in order to save himself from drowning. The situation he was in, odds were completely against him. He turned, reaching instinctively for a line that wasn't there. His lungs burned. His air was almost gone. He had to get out. Jake pushed off from the rock, kicking hard, trying to ascend. He fumbled for his regulator. His fingers met nothing. His harness, his tank. gone. However, he kept pushing, hoping for some miracle. Rescue divers arrived within an hour, their movements swift and precise. They entered the cave, navigating through the suspended silt, searching for Jake. What they found was not what they expected. The cave had not collapsed. The passage remained intact. They discovered Jake's body lodged in the crevice, but he was no longer stuck. They realized at some point he had managed to free himself, but he had no light, no guideline, just thick, blinding silt swirling around him. Investigators later pieced together what had likely happened. In his panic, he had ditched his harness and tank, wiggling free from the tight space. But in his disorientation, he had made a fatal mistake, attempting a free ascent without air. Without a light, without oxygen, he had tried to swim upward, holding his breath. As he rose, expanding gases in his lungs likely caused an embolism, leading to unconsciousness before he ever reached safety. His lifeless body was found at the 44-foot mark, drifting silently in the gloom. The news spread quickly, and early reports mistakenly blamed a cave collapse for the tragedy. But experts knew better. This was not the first, nor would it be the last, case of an untrained diver succumbing to the hidden dangers of an underwater labyrinth. Lisa, though devastated, survived. She would later admit she had underestimated the risks. The lack of a guideline, the absence of proper training, it all seemed so obvious in hindsight. Paradise Springs had been their playground, but that day, it became Jake's tomb. This next story is even more terrifying to watch. The main entrance of Cueva Cheve sits at an elevation of 2,700 meters, hidden within the rugged mountain terrain of northwest Oaxaca, Mexico. Among the deepest caves in the world, it has long been the site of ambitious exploration by American caving expeditions. Every year, a team of highly skilled cavers descends into its depths, pushing the limits of exploration and endurance. In late February, a team of 14 cavers gathered at Llano Cheve, their first objective clear, dived the sump at the cave's furthest known point. Days of meticulous rigging followed, securing the 35 vertical pitches between the entrance and Camp 2, positioned 850 meters below the surface. Rigging in Cueva Cheve was anything but straightforward. To preserve the integrity of the ropes for repeated use, the drops were rigged with rebelays, a system designed to prevent direct contact between the rope and the cave walls. Unlike a single free-hanging rope, this method required cavers to repeatedly disconnect and reconnect their rappel devices while suspended, an intricate and calculated process demanding precision, experience, and absolute focus. On February 25, 1991, a team of 6 made the arduous 7 to 10-hour journey through the cave to establish Camp 2. Over the following days, teams rotated in and out, ferrying supplies deeper into the system. On March 1st, Peter Bostad and Peter Haberland returned to the cave alongside 2 others, James Brown, recovering from a shoulder injury, and Chris Yeager, who had recently been suffering from illness. They entered the cave in staggered pairs, an hour apart, to prevent bottlenecks in the tight passages. Yeager and Haberland made steady progress. By 4:30 p.m., they reached Sac Newsom's well, a series of wet vertical pitches leading deeper into the system. At one point, Yeager dropped his rappel rack, an essential piece of descending gear, forcing him to borrow Haberland's to retrieve it. This minor mishap would later seem like an ominous prelude. By 7:40 p.m., they emerged from the wet passages, transitioning into the dry chambers that signaled the approach to Camp 2. They navigated the flagged junctions, briefly losing their way in the vast, featureless rock corridors, before finally regaining the correct path. The final obstacle before reaching Camp 2 was a 2-pitch descent into the East Gorge, a narrow, winding stream passage. Haberland, leading the way, explained the layout of the drop, a 10-meter slope of loose rock leading to a rebelay, followed by a sheer 23-meter descent. The rebelay was critical. Without it, the rope would drag dangerously against the rock face, quickly wearing through under repeated use. Haberland descended first, maneuvering carefully through the awkward rigging. The rebelay anchor was positioned too far below the natural stance, forcing him to attach a foot ascender to create slack and disconnect himself from the anchor safely. He called up to signal the descent was clear. Minutes later, from below, he heard Yeager call out. A rock came loose, clattering downward. Haberland braced himself, waiting for the expected off-rope signal. Instead, The cave erupted with the unmistakable sound of rushing air, followed by a sickening, heavy thud. Silence followed. He called out. No response. A sense of dread set in. He moved cautiously, climbing over the boulder sheltering him, peering into the darkness below. A motionless figure sprawled at the bottom of the drop. Jaeger lay face down in a shallow, 3-inch deep pool of water. His right leg twisted, his foot pointing unnaturally forward. His helmet, still strapped on, was pushed back at an odd angle. His arms were outstretched, fingers limp, gloves still intact. His pack, still strapped to his back, pressed him into the ground. Haberland scrambled forward, his breath shallow with panic. He reached Jaeger and carefully tilted his head against the wall to keep his face out of the water. He feared spinal injuries and resisted the urge to move him further. In the suffocating stillness of the cave, he realized with growing horror that Jaeger was unresponsive. He didn't check for a pulse, didn't attempt first aid. Overcome by the raw enormity of the moment, he turned and fled. His mind locked on one singular thought: get help. Blowing his whistle frantically, he sprinted through the cave toward Camp 2, covering in 15 minutes what had taken them hours before. Boston and Brown were there, resting after their own grueling journey. The message was clear. A caver was down. Within 10 minutes, they gathered dry clothes, a sleeping bag, and first aid gear, and made their way back to the accident site. Jaeger lay exactly as he had been left. Blood trickled from his nose, a stark contrast to the lifeless pallor of his face. Boston crouched beside him, reaching for a pulse. Nothing. The frigid air of the cave seemed to press in around them as they moved him carefully out of the water, placing his body onto a ledge and wrapping him in a sleeping bag. CPR was attempted, but the effort was futile. His lungs emitted a gurgling sound with each breath forced into him. After 20 minutes, his eyes and neck began to swell. A flashlight beam swept across his pupils. No reaction. He was gone. For hours they sat in the dim glow of their headlamps, absorbing the weight of their loss. The cave, once a site of adventure and discovery, had transformed into something merciless. In the days that followed, the team made the difficult decision to lay Jaeger to rest within the cave itself, interring him in a chamber just above the drop where he had fallen. His father, along with a few close friends, flew down to Mexico and entered the cave to assist in the burial. But grief is rarely a simple thing. Months later, his family had second thoughts. A team of cavers was assembled, and nearly a year after the accident, they succeeded in retrieving his body from the depths of Cueva Cheve. An investigation into the accident yielded troubling insights. When Haberland later ascended the rope, he discovered Jaeger's rappel rack still attached to the lower rope, about 2 meters beneath the Rebelle anchor. The locking carabiner securing it to his harness was open. Haberland demonstrated a chilling possibility. With no weight on the rack, it was possible for it to rotate in such a way that the stem of the rack forced the carabiner's gate open. The moment Jaeger put weight on it, it would have slipped free. The fall would have been instant, silent. He wouldn't have even had time to cry out. The incident raised pressing concerns about safety procedures in deep vertical caving. It was recommended that rappel devices be secured with a quick link or dual opposed locking carabiners to prevent unintended detachment. The importance of keeping packs tethered below the body, rather than worn on the back while rappelling, was emphasized to ensure maximum maneuverability. The Rebelle itself was scrutinized. It had been poorly rigged, requiring an unnecessarily complex maneuver that had already delayed Haberland's own descent. Tragedy is rarely the result of a single failure. Instead, it emerges from a chain of seemingly minor oversights, each one compounding upon the last. A poorly rigged Rebelle, a moment of distraction, a carabiner left unlocked. In the depths of Cueva Cheve, those small miscalculations culminated in irreversible loss. And yet, despite the risks, people continue to return, drawn to the unknown, compelled by the thrill of discovery. Cueva Cheve remains a place of awe and peril, where the margins for error are razor thin, and where the price of a single mistake can be measured in life and death.